Well, hello for my full semester and second 8 weeks classes in the fall of 2019. Glad to have you reviewing these PowerPoints where we'll be going over the first 15 chapters of the text. And we will have 3 midterm exams that will be related to the selection of 5 chapters for each one of those exams. So the first exam will cover chapters 1 through 5, and you may potentially have a question from one of those chapters. And then the second exam will be from chapters 6 through 10, same process there. There'll be 3 essay questions from that group. And then chapters 11 through 15. And our final, which will be comprehensive, will be covering the first 15 chapters of the text. So these PowerPoints should be helpful to you in preparation for those exams and also for the online quizzes that we have. So here we are with our coverage of Chapter 1. So you should get into a process of reviewing particular parts of the text and the website, and then also the syllabus in a very consistent basis. If you're reading roughly 1 to 2 chapters a week, you'll be in great shape. Review the syllabus to make sure that you're familiar with the due dates. And so if you are on the website, the web page every day, at least for a few minutes, if that's all, at least that will help you know if there's been any changes to the class. So make sure you get into that routine. We have online discussions. It's a great way to get to know some people in the class and to really start to think about this subject, American government, and relate it to the different parts of the textbook. And the same thing for the quizzes. Make sure then that you're prepared for each one of the chapter quizzes. We will have some opportunities in a more extended basis to share some ideas and to participate with other members of your group. And you know what group you're in if you review the material that's found in content and also that I have emailed to you. Okay. Some of the things that you ought to be doing on a very regular basis. Let's start working on those news reviews. They're due in sets of 5, just like the quizzes. But you shouldn't wait until the very last day or two to really work on all 5 of them. And again, they coincide with each chapter. So again, chapter 1, news review 1 would be over chapter 1. American political culture from chapter 1. So the purpose of this book is to show what government does, how and why, and what you can do about it. So it's an interesting way of bringing in citizenship and how you can be an active and involved citizen. This has been an area where there's been some questions about our ability to impact the political system, and those questions are going on today. And there's been some very effective research to say that we have a limited amount of ability, we as individual citizens, to really change the system. And the question here is centered on the term political efficacy. So political efficacy, which you can find in your text, deals with the ability to change the system, a belief that one can change the system. So some people have more political efficacy than others. And there's overall evidence that this political efficacy has been declining. And the question is why? That's the main part of the book, Bowling Alone. And so how can the American political community be revived is one of the ways of looking at the theme here in this book by Robert Putnam, Bowling Alone. Great book to read, and looks at this question. Can we become more effective citizens, and how can that happen? So in Bowling Alone suggests some of the reasons why political efficacy has declined is in changes in technology, the family structure, housing. People are not connected with one another as much as they used to be, at least not physically going to meetings, that kind of situation. Instead, people might be emailing one another or in contact that way. But the idea of really understanding another person and being involved with other people in some sort of club activity, just not happening as much. Again, that's Putnam's conclusions in his research and some of the reasons for it here. So these changes have created a diminishing stock in social capital. And you can see there community, social capital, community networks that motivate political participation. So overall, there's then this conclusion that people have less reason to be politically motivated, and they don't really see a way to get involved. Now, maybe we're seeing some building up of political efficacy, and that's somewhat evident by the voter turnout in the last two elections, and so perhaps more people are trying to find ways to be involved politically. So again, here's this issue of the ability to influence government and politics. And certainly one of the most straightforward ways that we could see that occur would be in voting, if the public is voting. So for each one of you, is something to consider. Do you feel like it's worthwhile to vote? Do you think it's worthwhile to follow campaigns and people who are running for office, to contact them? And to consider that this is a way that you can make changes in your society through the political process. If you believe so, then you have higher levels of political efficacy. So why this matters, and it's been an issue that's been questioned and bandied about for well over 2,000 years, has been whether or not democracy is a type of government that should be used. And if it's centered in the truth, then perhaps there's not an issue here, that the people who are running for office are focusing on the truth, and those who are better at describing the truth or coming to truthful conclusions are the ones who have a better chance of winning an election. But what if that's not the case? What if what really matters is public relations, the ability to tell a good story and convince people that you should be elected? The bust that you see there, the sculpture, is of Socrates. And Socrates, a Greek philosopher that believed that democracy had some serious problems. And the big problem was that it didn't focus on the truth. It focused on, again, how you were able to present yourself as a candidate, public relations, and that creates some real weaknesses then overall to the political system. So that's something that we should be aware of as citizens. What is the truthful issue that's being brought out in a campaign? Is it being truthful? And so we have to do our homework. We have to be prepared in that way. So read about democracy, read about that definition of democracy there. Now, there are different definitions of politics, and you can see that term in your text as well. There are 3 different definitions that we center on here. This is also part of our bonus project, so I would think many of you are interested in that project. And so you are to see how you can explain some aspect of our society today through these definitions. So who gets what, when, and how, that's a definition of politics from Harold Lasswell. And you look at the budget. So there's a budget for the national government, for state governments, city governments, county governments. And should there be a way of spending more, spending less? And at the end of all that, there's going to be a determination of who gets what, when, and how. Then you have the authoritative allocation of values. When someone wins an election, they are delivering their values also to a position of authority. And so that's the definition from David Easton. So how this country reacts and follows certain laws or ends certain types of policies regarding abortion or same-sex marriage will have a lot to do with who wins the elections and how the public feels about those people winning those elections. And then you can see here from your text the conflict over leadership structure and policies of government. And that's very straightforward. There are winners and losers in the system. And when people run for office, it's very high stakes, especially in the United States. It's a winner-take-all system. And so that's where you can see that conflict and how it emerges. So again, there's political struggles. Think about whether or not this is a topic that you find to be something that you bring out among people that you may not know that well. I would think in many cases people don't really share that topic much, politics. And why is that the case? Well, political struggles can become quite intense. And why are there struggles in the political system? Well, for one reason, there's limited resources. There's just not enough for everyone. Not enough of money, perhaps not enough of other types of resources. And there clearly is different values. In our discussions that we'll have throughout this semester among the different groups, some of you, for example, may be very supportive of medicinal marijuana, where others may find this to be quite threatening to society. Well, that's a stark difference among people to look at that issue. And so to have those different values, and as you can see here, the issue that do some people believe that freedom is more important than order, at least in some situations. Others may view it pretty much the opposite. And so that leads to some considerable differences and struggles in our society. Traditionally, you have three main reasons for government to exist: to maintain order, to provide public goods, and to promote equality. So of these three, certainly the first two are reasons for government existence, and you can think about governments existing throughout any type of civilization. I mean, when you see the symbols of ancient civilizations, it lets us know that those are government, at least directed, if not entirely part of government activity, such as the Egyptian pyramids or the Roman Colosseum. And so we can see here that these societies are centered around their government. And so the reason for governments are to maintain order, to provide public goods. All governments have followed those two roles. But perhaps in the last 300 years or so, we can see that governments are also there to promote some level of equality, some interpretation of equality. When you look at public goods, this is, as you can see here, the definition. This is found in your text in the chapter on economic policy. The good or service that is provided by the government because it either is not supplied by the market or is not supplied in sufficient quantities. So if the market cannot provide this particular service or good, then it is the state, the government, that would provide that. One of the better examples would be a road. Perhaps we do see that there are people who have a user fee to get on a road, but we don't have a case where we have a private business that operates a road. Instead, it would be a public good that is operated by the government. Within public goods, and again thinking of a reason why governments exist, there are going to be free riders. And the question then becomes, how many free riders can the government continue to abide and allow? To what degree should the government try to crack down on free riders within the system? So these would be groups or individuals who benefit without paying. And of course there can be different interpretations of the term free rider. So what exactly is a free rider in what situation? Now within government you have different dilemmas. And so there's two dilemmas that we should be familiar with. You have, if you look at these values that we all in some ways find of importance, freedom and order, I would assume everyone that's reviewing these recordings would think that both freedom and order are important. But you can't find freedom and order to be important at the same level. One has to take some precedence over the other in some situation. So you cannot support freedom and order at the same level. Enforcing order reduces freedom, and expanding freedom limits order. That's a dilemma. How much freedom do you allow? How much order do you enforce? And that dilemma has been around as long as governments have been in existence, and that's why we call it the classic dilemma. Then you have freedom versus equality. Enforcing equality reduces the freedom for individuals to make decisions. And allowing more freedom for some individuals can reduce the equality for others. So we may value equality, we may value freedom, but you can't find both of these to be as equally important. One has to have more value than the other in some situation. What would those situations be? So as we look at transgender laws, or some example of a transgender law, and you look at this question, how do you interpret this? Should gender be something that's viewed as a biological fact or a state of mind? And based on that interpretation, what type of equality should be enforced? And is it enforced at the level which may infringe upon other people's viewpoint of their freedom? And one of those ways of looking at that would be people making their own decisions on what restroom they use. Which gender of the restroom would they use? So we can see that that can lead to a conflict for some people in this modern dilemma, freedom versus equality. So when we look at government, this debate about the role of government has been around for centuries, as long as people have lived together. So you have the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes that believed the role of government should involve a very active and powerful and intrusive government. And the reason for that is that life without government is nasty, brutish, and short. So the life without it is far worse than any type of government that might exist. And it is interesting to consider when you review the philosophy there of Thomas Hobbes, and maybe you feel like he's going too far in trying to have an active government, which he may be doing. But what would life be like without government? He's suggesting that it would be a horrible situation. So you have to have a government. And even if that government might be abusive, it's still better than not having one. To counter the viewpoints of Hobbes, you have the Swiss philosopher Rousseau. And Rousseau's belief was that actually less government's best, and giving more freedom is a better situation. I prefer liberty with danger than peace with slavery. So let's have more freedom, and the problems that might arise by having more freedom are still better than more order. So I'm sharing both of those with you to consider on your own. And one of the key parts about this class is just to think about the subject more. So here's your opportunity to think about which one of these would you be more inclined to support, Hobbes or Rousseau? What is your viewpoint about the human being? What do you think people would be like if there was less government? Would it be a better situation or a worse situation? And your viewpoint about the human experience will have a lot to say with how you view the role of government. So as you can see here within the text about American political culture, that we do have conflicts, but we also have broadly shared values. So when you think about the American political culture, there's a way then of considering that people that are looking at the United States would come to the conclusion that there's certain ways of identifying American political culture. And the values of liberty, equality, and democracy would be some of the ways of identifying American political culture. We also then, if you have those particular type of values, you can also consider what type of area would our government most fit in a continuum of extremes. So you can draw out a continuum, and you hear that term continuum. That's CONTINUUM, continuum. And you have a range of differences between extremes. So the extremes here would be totalitarianism on one side and anarchism on the other. And within that, you can have different ranges of government. So as you can imagine, there's a huge difference between complete government control on one side and no government. So where would United States government fit, for example? We do allow for freedom, at least to some degree, among businesses and individuals, but there is still going to be government regulation. So certainly not a totalitarian government, but certainly not anarchy as well. And we see some big questions here that we continue to have throughout throughout our political system. And a big question is then, how trusting should we be? So going back to that difference between Rousseau and Hobbes, should we be giving government more authority? Do we need to have more protections? And just think about, through the use of technology, how governments can have a tremendous amount of control and power over people. The use of drones. I do find it interesting when we look at bureaucracy, and we'll be covering that in chapter 14 of our text. So sometime in November, for example, we'll be looking at that chapter. But we may think of the Defense Department using a great deal of drones, and they do, but actually the Agriculture Department has even more. And so perhaps all kinds of ways in which you have devices that are gathering information and potentially could cause serious harm to people. Now, they're not supposed to be doing that to American citizens, people living in the United States, but could that be a possibility? And if so, would the public be accepting of it? So how much trust should we have of our government? That was a big question from Edward Snowden, and I would urge you to Google this individual and read about his contributions and consider whether or not you find him to be a traitor or a hero, or maybe somewhere in between. But believe that the National Security Agency, one of the most powerful organizations in America, was violating the Constitution, violating the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, which we'll be covering when we get to chapter 4 in the text. And so Snowden went public with his information about the actions of the NSA. But should we allow for organizations like the NSA to do the kind of spying that they have been doing in order to protect us? What level of trust do we have on government, and how much protection do we need? Some major questions, things that you should be thinking of, not only throughout this class, but what you should be thinking of as a citizen. And that's what you need to do to be a good citizen. And hopefully most of you want to be good citizens. Informed and active membership in a political community. And that's what it means to be a good citizen, that you are informed. So when you're using your phone, looking over different kinds of websites, how about spend some time gathering the news as well and being informed about that? And then we leave by looking at just the changes in American population. So spend some time reading through these pages, the last part of the text here for chapter 1. Study of population, that's demography. And consider some of these questions. What is the current ethnic, racial variety in the United States? So are we seeing changes in this in the last few years? Should we anticipate changes in the next few decades to come? And where has this population shifted? Are there other parts of the country that are starting to increase their size and population, other places starting to lose that? Do we see changes when it comes to ethnicity, changes in age, changes in income, changes in religious identity? All that can have an influence on our political system, and these pages really start to emphasize these particular changes. So certainly look over those areas. All right, that's where we'll stop. And looking at Chapter 1, we'll be turning our attention to the U.S. Constitution when we cover Chapter 2.